Morning, Louisiana. Welcome to the Louisiana Procurement Training Program for school year 2024-2025. Please make a special note that as we go through the presentation, we will cover current requirements for this school year. Procurement regulations and administrative review standards typically change on an annual basis. For the guidelines presented today, different than what was required last year, which is important to note if you have a procurement review taking place this year. Because this year's procurement reviews likely cover the methods and procedures you use to procure goods and services in 2023-2024. This is also why you need to participate in procurement training annually and update your procurement procedures each year. If you haven't begun planning processes for procurement for next school year, right now is a good time to start. Part one of our presentation is an introduction to procurement. We'll get started with what procurement stands for in the child nutrition program arena and when using federal and state nonprofit school food service funds. Procurement is following the right steps to purchase goods, products, and services at the best possible price, while maintaining the high quality standards of the child nutrition program for nutritious meals that students look forward to every day. Procurement guidelines provide the framework for promoting competition across child nutrition program purchases, both small and larger purchases. This translates into the best prices, sound nutrition, and high quality meals that are appealing to students. All dollars spent. All right, I got a message that I'm staticky. Don't know. Hopefully you'll be able to hear me.
Hello, hello, hello.
All dollars spent on procurement must represent an investment into child nutrition program operations, and vendor purchases must be handled differently based on the amount forecasted for expenditures. Prior to determining the correct method for purchasing, an SFA must assess projected costs for individual purchases, the aggregate cost for similar items, and the total amount your SFA plans to spend for the year on things like food, supplies, milk, and services such as pest control. Think of procurement shopping for groceries for your family. Shoppers want to find a reliable grocer who can provide safe, high-quality food that is not expired or spoiled, all at a reasonable price. Similarly, procurement for child nutrition programs keeps the same goals in mind and uses informal or formal procedures for purchasing. These standards are adjusted for purchasing on a large scale for wise, fiscally sound investment of federal nonprofit funds. Purchasing for child nutrition programs involves vendors who provide food, supplies, and services for school food service, rather than for individual people filling a small shopping cart for their families. Common
Hey,
misunderstanding. Yes.
Tom, I'm so sorry. Your mic is pretty staticky. So there are some chats that people aren't able to understand. So are you able to like remove your mic and plug it back in or use a different version? Otherwise, I think we're just struggling to hear you a little bit.
I just tried unplugging and replugging.
Oh, that's better. Yep.
Okay. My apologies.
Yeah, I'll hop in if it happens again. But yep, I think that sounds better. Thank you.
I apologize to all you out there in Louisiana. Common misunderstanding about procurement is that most people think of it as one action, simply buying food, goods, or services. However, when using federal's child nutrition program dollars, procurement involves step-by-step procedures. These procedures must be handled consistently and ethically, according to the size of the purchase planned. In practice, Staff purchasing on behalf of the program must follow a code of conduct for purchases and must document every transaction. The required procedures and code of conduct for making child nutrition purchases ensures tax dollars are spent responsibly in support of quality food for our nation's school children.
I'm so sorry. It is breaking up again. So if it's okay, I can just hop in just so if that's all right, just to make sure that everybody can hear.
If you want to take over, go for it, Cami.
Sure. Okay, thank you. Yeah, if you wouldn't mind just keeping your slides up and I'll continue on.
Okay.
Okay. Perfect. So, since the primary funding for child nutrition program goods and services comes from federal sources, procurement in the child nutrition program must comply with federal, state, and local laws. Detailed records must be kept for every purchase and every dollar spent using CNP funds. These guidelines are true for purchases made with any state or local funds deposited or transferred into the nonprofit school food service account. Once funds hit the nonprofit school food service account, they are considered federal CNP funds and regulatory rules apply. During an administrative review, the financial review process includes an audit of resource management and procurement practices followed for school food services. At its core, procurement involves purchasing goods and services that support the operation of the child nutrition program. As Tom mentioned in the last slide, the processes and guidelines required in procurement promote competition and ensure the best value for school food service funds. Procurement procedures ensure quality products for producing the nutritious meals that your students look forward to every day. While there is overlap in the financial review process of resource management and procurement, these reviews may happen at the same time or separately. This presentation will focus solely on procurement, but best practices in procurement support sound fiscal management, which is reflected in the resource management review. Following sound procurement practices with the goal of putting high-quality food on students' plates throughout the school year starts with documenting the steps for procurement and outlining the practices that employees will follow when buying on behalf of the child nutrition program. While procurement can look complicated at first glance, participating in a course like this one on an annual basis is the best way to get ahead with a sound plan for the next school year. So looking ahead to school year 25 to 26, you may be thinking, where do I start? Purchasing food, supplies, and services for the school food service starts with the development of a procurement plan and code of conduct. To simplify the process, start with a state agency prototype procurement plan. The state agency typically designs a new plan for each school year. Next, tailor the procurement plan to fit all regulatory guidelines, including federal, state, local, and any LEA policies your board requires. When designing the plan, remember that state, local, and board policies can be stricter than federal guidelines, but not more lenient. Think of your procurement plan as the rule book for all procedures, methods, and documentation that must be followed by anyone who makes purchases for the child nutrition program using school food service funds. Following that step-by-step plan for every dollar spent in the school food service funds ensures financial aspects of the program are well documented, and it simplifies the financial portion of the administrative review. The Code of Conduct for Procurement outlines the responsibilities and guidelines that purchasing agents for the child nutrition program must follow to uphold compliance with regulations. Remember that following the procurement plan and Code of Conduct leads to high-quality food and services that support the child nutrition program and will help drive student participation in school meals. The benefits of sound purchasing practices also land in the periodic review of financial health of the school food service account. These practices promote fiscal responsibility and a better bottom line when reviewing the end of the school year's budget results. Every SFA must conduct a cost or price analysis to forecast or estimate what vendor purchases must be made in the next year for foods, equipment, supplies, and services. The sample procurement plan, code of conduct for procurement, and cost or price analysis will be discussed in a screenshot provided later in this presentation. Contact the state agency for the most updated version of the procurement plan and code of conduct. These samples are updated annually to reflect changes in federal and state regulations or policies. In part 3 of this presentation, we will go into further detail on the procurement review process to prepare you for each stage of the audit. Our next session, part 2, goes over the methods of procurement. So we've established what sound investment of the school food service funds translates into high quality meals that your students come to rely on for proper nutrition. Transforming your child nutrition program for top performance starts with fiscal responsibility and documenting procedures for each step of the process and for every purchase made. Execution of that plan brings us to part 2, the methods of procurement. Everyone enjoys finding a good deal when making purchases. That is why price is the primary determining criteria when it comes to the procedures required for procurement. When evaluating the type of procurement steps or methods to be followed, it's important to emphasize that federal guidelines represent a minimum requirement. State and local regulations may be stricter and require more formal procurement steps to be followed, but they cannot be less strict or less formal than federal regulations. Once funds are deposited into the school food service account, it must be managed as a federal grant fund in accordance with USDA Child Nutrition Program guidelines. The thresholds differ based on the type of school system the CNP operates in, which leads us to an illustration of the procurement thresholds where the price determines the procedures followed in purchasing. In planning procurement procedures, the first question is, how do child nutrition operators decide which steps to follow when making purchases? First, your thresholds will depend on whether your local educational agency operates as a public, private, nonprofit, or charter school. This slide covers public and private nonprofit school thresholds for school year 24 to 25. When determining thresholds and deciding on a procurement method, ask yourself these questions. How much do I plan to spend for this purchase? Is this just one purchase, or will I have to make similar or like kind purchases? What will the total cost of similar purchases be for the year? And if this is a one-time purchase, how much will it cost? After determining the cost, determine which threshold the price falls under. There are 3 thresholds for procurement. Higher priced purchases require more formal steps, whereas lower priced purchases require fewer steps and informal purchasing methods. Remember that every purchase requires backup documentation, even for an inexpensive item. Micro purchases are categorized as those vendor purchases that do not exceed $10,000. In Louisiana, small purchases, often called simplified acquisition purchases, are required when a vendor charges between $10,000 to $60,000. For school food authorities that self-certified with the state agency for a higher threshold for micro purchases, the micro purchase threshold can be raised to $30,000. This $30,000 cap on the small purchase threshold is established by Louisiana Executive Order number JBE 2020-21. Make a note that this threshold is stricter than the self-certification threshold established by federal regulation, and all Louisiana schools must comply with that stricter limit. There are several requirements for self-certification that must be met. These requirements are subject to audit, which will be discussed in more detail later in the presentation. $60,000 is the point of the small purchase threshold. Purchases of $60,000 or more fall under formal procurement requirements. Formal procurement is required for large purchases over $60,000. An example of a formal procurement may be a school district that issues an annual food and supply bid. Most sponsors follow formal procurement processes for food and supply bids, even if the total cost for the year is expected to be less than $60,000. This is because the contractual advantages and benefits of the competitive bid process. Essentially, contracts allow for clearly defined service and quality expectations that must be delivered by the awarded vendor, and the competitive process leads to better prices. Our next slide covers the required thresholds for charter schools. The only difference for charter schools is that the small purchase threshold is higher at $250,000. It's important to note that charter schools in Louisiana are exempt from many state procurement laws. However, they are still required to follow federal procurement regulations when federal funds are involved, such as those from the Child Nutrition Program. Additionally, charter schools may establish procurement policies, which can set more restrictive thresholds than federal regulations. Therefore, it's essential for each charter school to review its internal policies to ensure compliance. The next slides will cover each threshold and the methods required to comply with child nutrition program regulations. To start, remember to keep documentation on every dollar spent. The Code of Federal Regulations defines a micro purchase as a purchase of supplies or services, the aggregate amount of which does not exceed the micro purchase threshold. Let's discuss what this means. The micro purchase threshold is the lowest threshold requirement, and it is used for low dollar, infrequent purchases that typically could not be planned in advance. The purpose of the micro purchase threshold is to expedite low cost transactions and reduce administrative burden. Price is the determining factor for thresholds, and the purchase must be $10,000 or less, unless the SFA self-certified with the state agency for a higher threshold up to $30,000. This method is informal and is typically used for buying special or one-time products. Examples of micro purchase may be that a soy-free food item is needed for a student with an allergy, or for a low dollar purchase when a delivery shortage requires to purchase a few items to complete the meal service. As a standard, these purchases are for items the CNP operator typically cannot forecast when conducting small purchase quotes or formal proposals or bids. Prices for goods or services purchased under this method should generally be considered reasonable, which can be assessed by browsing typical prices online. To the maximum extent practicable, the non-federal entity should distribute micro purchases equitably among qualified suppliers. This means that when making trips to the store, use a list of different groceries or shops and stop at different stores on different days. This helps to spread the wealth and supports multiple businesses using taxpayers' federal funds instead of giving that benefit to only one business. Use caution when conducting micro purchases. Micro purchases must not be used to circumvent free and open competition. In the case that multiple purchases of similar or same type items will need to be made over the year, then use the small purchase or formal procurement method. Micro purchase procedures are the simplest method of procurement in that the only required documentation is to provide receipts that show you are using different stores when making purchases. No competitive quotes are required for the micro purchase method. Remember that the items on the receipt must be an allowable use of school food service funds, and the prices for the goods must be reasonable. Next up for discussion is the meaning of aggregate purchases and how to ensure micro purchases are not used to circumvent free and open competition. An example scenario of an aggregate purchase might be if several kitchens needed a new warmer for a total of 10 warmers. Each warmer may only be $3,500, which is under the micro purchase threshold, but the total purchase cost for all 10 would be $35,000. A $35,000 aggregate purchase falls under the small purchase method, and 3 price quotes would be required. If an SFA were to purchase one warmer a month over 10 months, this would be considered circumventing competition and would be a finding on a procurement review. During a procurement review, this amount may have to be paid back to the nonprofit school food service account from a non-federal fund source as part of corrective action. In recap, when deciding to use the micro purchase method, make sure that the total expenses are less than $10,000 for any individual item or a group of similar items. This amount may be higher, up to $30,000, only if the state agency approved the self-certification application prior to purchasing. Generally, if you can anticipate spending $10,000 or more, use small purchase procedures to compare prices. Spread your purchases across different local grocers, shops, or vendors to ensure fair distribution and get the best quality and prices for your child nutrition dollars. Always keep all receipts for micro purchases in an easily accessible folder for review. When in doubt, go with a more formal procedure. Our next topic defines the requirements for self-certifying for the higher $30,000 micro purchase threshold. SFAs may establish a threshold higher than the micro purchase threshold outlined in federal regulation 2 CFR 220, Part 320. Based on certain annual criteria, proof the SFA is a low financial audit risk and an annual self-certification. A low-risk auditee must have no financial audit findings, and a low-risk designation must be indicated in the annual audit report. This single audit report is often called the legislative audit report or an independent audit report. In Louisiana, a sponsor may self-certify a micro-purchase threshold up to $30,000 on an annual basis as part of the CNP online application. The certification must be approved by the state agency prior to making purchases using micro-purchase methods under the higher 30,000 threshold. Note that this certification became available in school year 24 to 25, and it is not retroactive. In addition to the required self-certification, the SFA must maintain documentation on file and readily available to USDA, the state agency, and auditors in accordance with 2 CFR 200 Part 334. The self-certification must include a justification, clearly identify the threshold amount, and the SFA must maintain supporting documentation on file for at least one of the following 5 areas. A qualification as a low-risk auditee in accordance with the criteria outlined in 2 CFR 200 Part 520 for the most recent audit. An annual internal institutional risk assessment to identify, mitigate, and manage financial risks. Or for public institutions, a threshold that is both $30,000 or less and is consistent with state law. Procurement procedures must be updated, and a written justification must be provided to the state agency with the reason for requesting the increased threshold. When discussing self-certification for a higher micro-purchase method, there are a few things to consider before self-certifying a higher threshold than the federal threshold of $10,000. First, what is the local policy for micro-purchases for the school system? If the local policy is stricter, requiring a lower amount, then that threshold is required. An example could be that small purchases are required for any purchase over $5,000 at the local educational agency in accordance with the school board policy. The second thing to discuss or consider would be for child nutrition program operations. Does the $10,000 micro purchase threshold and method get you the prices and quality that you need? Small purchase procedures require specifications and 3 price quotes before awarding to the lowest price to a qualifying vendor. And lastly, does the SFA have the capacity to train all staff purchasing on behalf of the child nutrition program to ensure that procedures are followed to prevent circumventing free and open competition and compliance with all procurement regulations? To check on self-certification approval for a higher micro-purchase threshold, go to the CNP website under Forms, click on Schedule A, and choose Documents and Certifications. There's a drop-down box where you should see the statement SFA Higher Threshold and Certification Document. For audit purposes, I recommend you print this screen for proof of self-certification to include with other required documents for self-certification of the higher micro-purchase threshold discussed in the prior slide. The next threshold for discussion is the small purchase threshold, often referred to as the simplified acquisition method. The small purchase method is an informal way to buy goods and services for the child nutrition program when a single or aggregate cost of a purchase is above the micro purchase threshold, but below the formal procurement threshold. It is quicker and simpler than formal procurement methods that require solicitation and sealed bids or competitive proposals, but still ensures fair competition and sound use of federal funds. As a note, when low-cost items are under the micro-purchase method but can be forecasted, small purchase methods should be used to encourage competition, ensure quality, and for the best value of the child nutrition program funds. For small purchases, there are 4 steps to the process. The first is to develop specifications for the food, supplies, or services that are required. The second step is to obtain 2 to 3 price quotes from different vendors based on the amount of the purchase. For the purposes of this training and to ensure compliance with state and federal regulations, obtaining 3 quotes is a best practice for small purchases. These 3 quotes must be documented and can be obtained by phone, fax, email, or a website. Specifications for products must be documented along with prices listed according to the vendor's name. All details and requirements of the purchase discussed with the vendor must be documented as well. The third step is to ensure the solicitation complies with the Buy American Act. The fourth step is to evaluate the 3 vendor price quotes for a purchase. The SFA must ensure that all vendors provided a price based on the same product specifications. The lowest price from a responsive vendor determines which quote to use and who to purchase from. The requirements for the small purchase method can be referred to as 3 price quotes and a purchase. SFAs that are only able to obtain 1 or 2 quotes should ask other vendors for a reason that they cannot provide the goods or services requested. Document the reason for non-response by vendor to reach a total of 3 responses. An email is the best way to get a documented response, but writing down the details from a phone call is sufficient. Understanding formal procurement procedures is essential when making large purchases for your school's child nutrition program. Formal procurement is required when purchases exceed the state small purchase threshold for public and private nonprofit schools of $60,000. The threshold for formal purchases is higher, as we discussed, for charter schools, which is $250,000. Remember that local formal procurement thresholds are often lower, so always check federal, local, and state rules before developing your procurement plan and establishing a formal purchase threshold. Keep in mind that most school systems choose to use formal purchases for food, supply, and equipment bids due to the advantages of the competitive bid process, even if projected costs for the year are under the formal threshold. The formal bid process can lead to better quality products and services that are contractually defined and therefore more dependable. A structured competitive process ensures fairness and supports compliance with federal regulations. In a formal procurement, a sponsor can incorporate technical requirements, product specifications, and geographic preference to target local products. Formal procurement methods require following documented procurement procedures. Here you see the steps required to conduct a formal purchase. Prior to developing a solicitation, a cost or price analysis must be performed and documented for every procurement in excess of the simplified acquisition or small purchase threshold. The first step after performing a cost or price analysis is to develop a solicitation in the form of an invitation to bid or request for proposal. For the 2 types of formal procurement contracts, the invitation for bid is used when price is the only evaluation factor. With the request for proposal, additional scoring criteria comes into play, which must be provided upfront to vendors as part of the RFP packet. The second step is to ensure all regulatory requirements and clauses, including the Buy American provision, are included in the IFB or RFP. The third step is to publicly advertise the solicitation. As a best practice, school systems advertise in various ways, including a web-based bid platform on a school website, and the newspaper, and send solicitations directly by email to several prospective vendors. Sending solicitations by email also provides an audit and paper trail for documenting no bid responses from vendors. The fourth step is to accept and evaluate responses, typically referred to as sealed bids that are publicly opened at a set place, date, and time for a formal bid opening. The fifth step is to accept and evaluate responses using criteria developed upfront in the solicitation. Remember to establish price as the highest weighted score when establishing criteria for a request for proposal. Additional scoring criteria may count toward the award, but may not be weighted higher than price as the predominant factor. Once the evaluation of the bids is complete, the responsible vendor with the best price or score must be notified of the award in writing, pending contractual approvals by the LEA board, superintendent, and the CNP authorized representative. Certain types of formal procurement may require the presence of the state agency at bid opening and/or to approve the final bid prior to final LEA approvals and notifying the vendor of the award. Do not forget that formal procurement procedures are not over when the contract and bid is awarded. Step 6 is to monitor the contract. Monitoring and documenting performance of contract terms and conditions is required throughout the year. Additionally, invoices must be compared to the initial prices and terms of the contract to ensure any under or overcharging is corrected in a timely manner. Every sponsor or SFA must complete an annual procurement plan that is compliant with federal and state regulations for each method of procurement, whether it is a micro purchase, small purchase, or formal purchase. As we mentioned earlier, check with the state agency about an annual prototype procurement plan and a prototype IFB or RFP to ensure regulations are outlined and procedural requirements are included in formal procurements. Cross-check the finalized procurement plan against federal, state, and local guidelines prior to implementing procedures each year. General procurement standards are outlined in 2 CFR 200 Part 318, and formal procurement methods regulation is at 2 CFR 200 Part 320 Subpart B. Schools and child nutrition programs can work together or use outside services to buy food and supplies, possibly at better prices. There are 3 main ways to participate in group purchasing efforts. First, there are cooperatives made up of CNP program operators or state agency agreements. Second is agents, and third is by use of third-party entities. Child nutrition program operators from different school systems can work together in cooperatives, hire help in the form of agents to assist with procurement, or use state contracts, which are third-party entities, to buy food and supplies. The important thing to remember when using a cooperative, agent, or third-party entity is that procurement regulations still must be followed, and these group purchasing efforts cannot be selected as a way of circumventing free and open competition. Please reference USDA Memo SP 05-2017 for questions and answers on these group purchasing efforts. Some tips to remember are that the burden of proof and documentation of procurement is the responsibility of the SFA, not the cooperative, agent, or third party when it comes to audits. An agent services can be procured to assist with procurement. However, hiring an agent without a written contract detailing the procurement responsibilities, as outlined in the annual procurement plan, is a mistake to avoid. It also should be clear that agents must select vendors in a competitive manner without conflict of interest or financial benefits from selected vendors. Note that an agent must also be procured for services provided based on the cost of the service and the corresponding threshold. In terms of the 3 group purchasing efforts, small purchases still require specifications and 3 quotes. For formal purchases, the SFA is required to ensure the solicitation process and bids are evaluated properly for award, and that monitoring takes place throughout the school year to ensure performance. In other words, all 5 steps of the formal procurement procedure must be confirmed and complete. Each state agency handles cooperatives and third-party entity procurement a bit differently, so please reach out for any unique or specific situations related to your SFA's procurement. Also, never assume contracts under group purchasing efforts meet federal and state procurement requirements. Always review documentation to ensure procurement procedures are followed, and contracts include all language, procedures, and clauses for compliance with procurement regulations. Our next slide covers tips on third-party entities. Louisiana has various state contracts considered third-party entities that school districts often use to simplify purchasing practices. School officials using state or local funds may purchase directly from state contracts, whereas there are stricter procedures for federal child nutrition program expenditures. It is important to note that only certain state contracts meet the federal regulations that are outlined in USDA regulations for the child nutrition programs. State or third-party contracts must be evaluated annually to ensure procurement regulations are fulfilled and updates are made in accordance with regulatory changes. SFAs can purchase from a state contract that meets federal regulations for procurement by following the appropriate micro, small, or formal purchase procedures. The method of procurement is based on the price threshold of the purchase that must be followed. Remember to obtain a receipt for micro purchase, obtain 3 quotes based on specifications for small purchase, and perform solicitation, advertisement, and the entire bid process for formal procurement. The state contract must be considered as only one of the 3 quotes for small purchases and only one bid for evaluation of award for formal procurement. In other words, a state contract under a third-party entity is considered only one source when evaluating quotes and bids. In addition, the responsibility lies with the SFA to ensure all procurement regulations and procedures are documented and followed within the third-party entity's state contract. Performance of the contract will need to be monitored and invoices compared to contract pricing to ensure provisions are fulfilled in compliance with specifications, regulations, terms, and conditions. The procurement review process involves an audit of documented procedures, the code of conduct for procurement, and methods used by your SFA when purchasing goods and services using school food service funds. The procurement review covers all child nutrition program purchases, not just the sites selected under the administrative review. For a summary of procurement standards in 2 CFR 200 Part 318 through 326, follow the link on this slide. These are the procurement regulations. The procurement review checks that you follow the rules. Purchases must meet federal, state, and local guidelines. Everyone gets a fair chance and there is no favoritism. Vendors must compete for the best price. This way, you get the best value. The goal is to spend wisely and avoid waste. Records are clear. You must keep proof of what you bought and how you picked the vendor. Vendors do their job. If you hire a company, they must deliver what was promised. The review helps you by protecting your program from mistakes or penalties, stretches your funds for more meals and better services, and keeps things fair and transparent so everyone plays by the rules. The procurement review requires a separate review instrument that financial reviewers use to assess school food authority compliance with federal procurement regulations and policies. The procurement tool is your one-stop Excel reference point that provides an overview of the requirements of this review and a snapshot of purchases made for the year by vendor, classified by purchase method. The SFA starts the process of the procurement review by filling out the SFA procurement table. This table breaks down all vendor purchases by the type of goods and services provided, the total amount paid by vendor, and the type of procurement followed. For example, micro purchase, small purchase, or formal contracts. Request a vendor paid list from the business office for the prior school year to fill out the procurement tool and ensure all vendor expenditures are represented with the total spent annually on procured goods and services. Vendors should be listed in the tool by the method used to perform the purchase. The categories, once again, for purchasing methods include micro purchases, small purchases, and formal purchases. Any vendors selected for award by market basket analysis or group purchasing efforts are categorized separately. Food Service Management Company contracts and USDA foods processing contracts are also categorized in separate fields. This provides a complete breakdown of nonprofit school food service account expenditures by the procurement method that you used for each vendor paid throughout the prior school year. At the start of the procurement review, initial documents will be requested. These documents include the vendor paid list, the completed SFA procurement table tab in the tool, which will be provided to you in an email, your SFA's written procurement plan, and the code of conduct for procurement. A USDA Child Nutrition Program procurement plan is a required document that ensures all purchases made with federal funds comply with federal, state, and local procurement regulations. It provides a step-by-step approach for acquiring goods and services while maintaining fair, open, and competitive practices. Documented procurement procedures must be tailored to your SFA and approved annually. Procedures that are outlined in the procurement plan include defining procurement threshold amounts for the different methods of procurement, outlining the steps involved in procurement based on each method and purchasing threshold, characteristics of specific types of procurement methods, detailing how oversight and management of contracts will take place, explaining the who, how, and when in terms of conducting an annual cost or price analysis in preparation for annual purchasing, including language that prohibits acquisition of unnecessary or duplicative items, and finally, describing the Buy American requirement, other required CNP clauses, and how guidelines will be followed in procurement practices. If you have used the state agency sample procurement plan in the past to tailor your SFA's policy, you probably recognize this screenshot. Contact your state agency for the updated sample procurement plan published on an annual basis. Make sure certain you are using the latest plan when developing your SFA's procurement plan for school year 25 to 26. The Code of Conduct, which the state titles as Standards of Conduct and Certification for Procurement, prevents conflict of interest in procurement activities by requiring employees that make purchasing decisions to sign attestations that they will not engage in activities like accepting gifts. Compliance with the Code of Conduct provides an attestation that employees purchasing on behalf of the Child Nutrition Program do not have a financial or other interest in the award of contracts. Annual review of the written Code of Conduct should assess any real or apparent conflicts of interest in performing the selection, award, and/or contract administration in compliance with federal regulations. The Code of Conduct must be signed by all employees of the SFA that participate in purchasing activities on a yearly basis. The state provides 2 templates that can be utilized. The first is a separate Standards of Conduct and Certification for Procurement, and the second option is to include the state template procurement procedures. Both can be found by going to the CNP website Memos and Forms section. Circling back to the procurement table that must be completed for submission to the reviewer at the start of the review, let us review a sample vendor paid list. This document is used to complete the SFA procurement table. As you can see in this example, the vendor paid list provides a summary of total expenditures broken down by vendor name and the total amount paid by vendor over the course of the prior year. Each vendor, along with the total amount paid to the vendor using school food service funds, must be included in the SFA procurement table by the method that was used to procure the goods or services from that vendor. The procurement table is very important as it drives the entire procurement review process. Vendor information should be entered into the tool based on the method used to procure goods or services from the vendor, not based solely on the total dollar amounts paid to them. For example, if a vendor was paid a total of $3,000 and the SFA obtained quotes for the purchase, it would be entered as a small purchase, not a micro purchase. For SFAs with a food service management company contract, the review will assess how the SFA procured the FSMC services, not how the FSMC procured its vendors. The SFA is always the responsible party for completing the table in the review, not a FSMC employee, agent, or third-party representative. The screenshot seen here represents the SFA procurement table. This is the only tab that you will need to fill out when you receive the procurement tool. The headings and subheadings guide the information that needs to be entered into the tool and will be discussed in the upcoming slides. In the Procurement Authority section, the SFA will list the names, positions, or titles and contact information for staff responsible for making school food service purchases in compliance with local, state, and federal program regulations, including USDA Child Nutrition Program rules and regulations. Next up for entry are the procurement thresholds. Enter the micro purchase threshold required by the LEA and SFA. The state micro purchase threshold is $10,000 for Louisiana, which should be entered on the next line. On the third line, enter the SFA small purchase threshold. On the bottom line, enter the state small purchase threshold of $60,000 for public and private nonprofit schools or $250,000 for charter schools. Market basket analysis for evaluation of contract award is a procurement evaluation method used to compare vendor pricing by analyzing a representative sample of commonly purchased items rather than the full list of goods or services. If an SFA uses this method of analysis, then this section must be completed. If not, then answer no and leave this section blank. If yes, the SFA must enter the vendor's name that was awarded the bid, the goods or services provided, the total amount paid to the third-party vendor, and the group purchasing entity type if applicable. If an SFA is part of a child nutrition cooperative, used an agent to procure goods or services on their behalf, or used a third-party group for procurement, enter yes in this box of the group purchasing efforts box. And this section will need to be completed. If not, enter a no into the box and move to the next section. To complete this section, the SFA must enter the name of the group purchasing effort, the goods or services provided, the total amount paid to the vendor or third party, and the group type. In the comments, it is helpful to enter the name of the vendor that is being used as a result of the group purchasing effort. The micro purchase section begins the portion of the tool that covers each procurement method. Micro purchases represent purchases that required a receipt for documentation, but no specifications and quotes were obtained. Enter the vendor's name, brief description of the goods or services provided, such as food or equipment repairs, the total amount paid to the vendor, the number of purchases made from the vendor, and any additional comments in this section. It is helpful to enter a comment explaining why this vendor was used and how purchases were spread equitably where applicable. Fill out the small or informal purchases section for those purchases that required written specifications and price quotes prior to purchasing. For small purchases, enter the vendor's name, goods or services provided, total paid to the vendor, number of purchases made from each vendor, indicate if more than one response was received, and whether a third party was used. If the SFA contracted with sealed bids, such as request for proposal or invitation for bid, the SFA will enter the vendor information under this section of formal contracts. The SFA must enter the vendor's name, goods or services provided, the contract value or total paid to each vendor, the type of solicitation, so an RFP or IFB, if it is a fixed price or cost reimbursable contract, the contract duration, if more than one response was received, if it was obtained by a group purchasing effort, and if any amendments were made to the contract after the contract award. Amendments include contract renewals and adding goods or services to the original contract. For SFAs with an FSMC, enter the vendor and contract information under the FSMC section. The SFA must enter the FSMC name, the goods or services provided, contract value or total paid to the FSMC, solicitation type, once again, RFP or IFB, if it is fixed price or cost reimbursable, the contract year, if more than one response was received, if it was obtained by a group purchasing effort, and if any amendments were made after the contract award. Please note that the review will assess how the LEA procured the FSMC services, once again, not how the FSMC procured its vendors. The SFA is responsible for completing the table and the review, not the FSMC. For SFAs that divert USDA commodities for processing, enter the processing vendors under this section. The SFA will need to enter the processor name, the goods provided, contract value or total spent, procurement type, contract duration, if more than one response was received, if it was obtained by a group purchasing effort, and if any amendments were made to the contract after award. A checklist of documents required for submission by the SFA for the procurement review is included under the SFA Instructions tab of the procurement tool at the bottom of the page. An important consideration to keep in mind when reviewing documentation in comparison to federal regulations in the procurement tool is that each state may require different or more stringent requirements in the review process that must be evaluated and documented. For an initial overview of documents that is not all-inclusive, let us begin with high priority documents, which include the written code of conduct. This document should be signed by all employees of the SFA that participate in purchasing activities. As we mentioned earlier, it prevents conflict of interest in procurement activities by requiring employees that make purchasing decisions to sign attestations that they will not engage in activities like accepting gifts. Also, the code of conduct ensures employees do not have a financial or other interest in the award of contracts. The review of the written code of conduct should assess any real or apparent conflicts of interest in performing selection, award, and/or contract administration in compliance with federal regulations. Other documents for initial review include documented procurement procedures, often called the SFA procurement plan. And as we discussed, it is a list of procedures that the SFA will follow to ensure that procurement activities are performed and documented in compliance with regulations. Next is the vendor paid list, which will provide a list of every vendor that is paid for goods or services out of CNP funds. A summary of total expenditures by vendor report will give the total amount paid to each vendor over the course of the year. The school food service general ledger will provide an itemized list of expenses paid for every dollar expended throughout the school year, which with details on the vendor paid list, a description of items purchased, and the date the expense was incurred, and any other details. Bid quotes and responses are required for submission by the SFA to review if procurement procedures, contract requirements, and awards were handled properly, as well as monitored for compliance in accordance with regulations. Purchase orders and invoices flagged during the assessment of the SFA procurement tab by expenditure will be submitted by the SFA to validate the purchase and if the appropriate threshold procedures were documented and followed. Vendor selection is the next step in the procurement review process. In this phase, the reviewer will examine the procurement tool and the vendor paid list submitted by the SFA. The reviewer will then select a sample of vendors based on established criteria and the procurement methods used. To facilitate this process, the reviewer will provide the SFA with a vendor selection checklist, which will include a list of vendors selected for review, along with the required documentation to submit for each one. Ensuring that vendors are correctly entered into the procurement tool according to the procurement method used is critical to making sure the reviewer can request the appropriate documentation. The SFA Instructions tab of the procurement tool outlines the required documentation for each procurement method. This list is not exhaustive and additional documents may be requested during the review, but it serves as a good starting point for the minimum documents you should be prepared to provide when you receive the vendor selection checklist for this phase of the procurement review. Next, we will walk through the three main procurement methods, micro, small, and formal, and discuss the specific documentation required for each, beginning with micro purchases. If the micro purchase method is used for certain purchases, the reviewer will request up to 3 of the SFA's purchase orders, invoices, receipts, or similar documents, and a written explanation of why the micro purchase method was used. The goal of the review is to ensure that micro purchase requirements are being met. Key considerations include purchases should be distributed equitably to the extent possible among qualified suppliers. Purchase prices should be reasonable, meaning that a prudent person would consider the price fair based on research, past experience, or purchase history. Keep receipts on file and retain them for at least 3 years, including the current year. Tips for success in making micro purchases include that documentation is key. Ensure your documentation provides a complete picture of why the micro purchase method was chosen. Keep a record of any research, web searches, or reasoning for using the micro purchase method. With these best practices, you'll be prepared for the procurement review. Now let's move on to small purchases. As previously mentioned, small purchases require specifications and 3 price quotes for a purchase. If the small purchase method was used, the reviewer will request the following documentation: solicitation documents, including specifications and evaluation criteria, all quotes or responses received, including documented responses for those that decided not to provide a quote and why, an evaluation of responses for award, purchase orders, receipts or invoices, and if it applies, any contract and contract terms. Contracts are not required for the small purchase method, but if there is a contract agreement for a small purchase, keep it on file for review. This slide shows a sample specification for milk. When drafting specifications, it's important to keep in mind certain things that could limit full and open competition. Ask questions to yourself when writing specifications, such as, are the requirements from the vendor appropriate for the goods or services? Does the experience fit with what is being requested? If a brand name is included, is there language stating that an equivalent product would also be accepted? Some tips for success when using small purchase procedures include keep all documentation, ensure all relevant records are retained, including quotes, purchase orders, receipts, and evaluation notes. Get an adequate number of quotes. Make sure the number of quotes complies with the applicable thresholds. So as a best practice, document 3 price quotes for evaluation. Write clear, comprehensive specifications. Well-defined specifications are crucial for promoting fair competition. The key takeaway for the review is documentation is critical. Ensure your records clearly show that the small purchases were awarded to the lowest cost, responsive, and responsible bidder. This includes maintaining quotes, invoices, receipts, emails, and phone call logs. Small purchases do not require public advertising. They can be solicited informally, such as by phone, email, or online. However, if specifications are provided by phone, a written copy of those specifications must be retained. If you use an online website to compare prices, ensure that you save screenshots showing the product, price, and date of the comparison. If you only receive one quote after reaching out to multiple vendors, you cannot consider a no bid as a valid response. Here are a few alternatives for obtaining more quotes. Search online for additional vendors, advertise in local newspapers or on the SFA's website, or contact area school district CMP directors to see what vendors are available. To ensure all vendors are competing on equal footing, the same specifications must be provided to every vendor. This promotes full and open competition. The specification should clearly describe the goods or services being requested. If the purchase involves food items, the specifications must include the Buy American provision. However, this provision does not apply to non-food purchases or services, such as pest control, office supplies, or equipment. This sample quote summary is an example of how to review and evaluate multiple quotes. The SFA must keep a record of how the quotes were compared. The documentation should clearly show that the small purchase was awarded to the lowest priced quote from a responsive and responsible vendor. Formal contracts require more extensive documentation and compliance with specific contract terms. When formal contracts, either IFB or RFP, are solicited, the reviewer will request the following documentation: solicitation documents, including solicitations, evaluation criteria, contracts, advertisements for bids or proposals, bidder or offeror responses, bid opening documentation, such as sign-in sheets, evaluation of responses for contract award decisions, executed contracts, contract renewals, addendums, or amendments if applicable, cost or price analysis documentation, non-competitive proposal authorization if applicable, and invoices. So at least 3 vendor invoices identifying the goods or services procured and the amounts paid. Please note that formal contracts must include specific language stating that the contract award will be made to the lowest responsive and responsible bidder or offeror whose offer is most advantageous to the child nutrition program. Price must be weighted in the highest in scoring criteria. Before diving deeper into formal contracts, please take a look at the CNP website for some prototype procurement forms. These forms can assist SFAs with their procurement processes and include sample procurement plans, a sample code of conduct, formal bid checklist, and required certificates and contract provisions. While these forms support the SFA's procurement practices in general regulatory areas, compliance with federal, state, and local procurement regulations remain the SFA's responsibility. Always review procurement documents and activities for compliance with USDA, state, and local requirements. When reviewing formal contracts, the procurement reviewer will assess several factors, including full and open competition. So the solicitation process must be transparent and not restrict competition. If competition is unduly limited, the SFA may be required to conduct a new solicitation. Adequate number of sources. A minimum of 2 bids or proposals must be received to ensure fair competition. Adequate response time. Response time should be reasonable based on the nature of the goods or services being procured. For example, a grocery bid may require more time for vendors to respond than a bid for a single item like a food service vehicle. Advertising method. Consider the reach of your advertisement. For example, a local newspaper may have a limited circulation, while a larger city newspaper or an online platform could reach more vendors. Clear specifications. The solicitation must clearly define the goods or services being requested and include any attachments required for vendors to submit their bids or proposals. Buy American provision. All food purchases must comply with the Buy American provision, ensuring that food products are sourced from the US unless a waiver is granted. Contract provisions. Certain provisions are required as part of formal contracts, and SFAs must monitor contractor performance to ensure compliance with the contract terms. Monitoring should include verification that products or services delivered meet contract specifications and that pricing is consistent with the agreed upon terms. The SFA is responsible for ensuring that contractors adhere to the terms of the contract. Your procurement procedures should outline how monitoring will occur. This includes ensuring that the products or services received meet contract requirements, verifying that prices align with the contract terms, identifying any discounts, rebates, or credits on invoices, especially for cost reimbursable contracts. Monitoring should be documented each time it is performed. Always maintain clear records of how and when contractor performance is reviewed. So let's compare different types of procurement arrangements, including piggybacking, use of an agent, and third parties. If an SFA piggybacks onto an existing contract by using another child nutrition program or organization's procurement contract, the SFA must ensure that the original contract includes provisions allowing additional parties to join the agreement. This includes verifying that the original solicitation specifically states that additional parties may join, along with any limitations, for example, the dollar value or number of parties that can be added. The SFA must also confirm that adding the SFA as a party does not create a material change in the original contract's terms. The original contract must include the value of the items all parties need to order for the year. For example, if the SFA uses a contract awarded by another SFA, the second SFA must retain all necessary procurement documentation. Additionally, the original contract should include language specifying that others can piggyback on the agreement. If this language is absent, or if the addition creates a material change, a new competitive procurement will be required. Finally, the SFA must have a written agreement with both the original SFA and the vendor, verifying that the SFA is allowed to use the contract. So using agents for procurement. If an agent is used for procurement, the SFA must ensure it follows all applicable procurement regulations. An agent could be a third-party procurement service, a cooperative executive director, or another procurement agency. Note that the SFA remains responsible for compliance with procurement rules even when using an agent. If an SFA uses a third party, like a state contract for food service, the third party's pricing may be used as one source or response during the procurement process. Examples of third parties could be a state U.S. Foods, Premier, or Milk contract. However, there are key points to remember. Non-CNP entities. Using a non-CNP cooperative vendor for CNP purchases without a competitive procurement is not allowed. CNP cooperatives, if the cooperative is a CNP approved entity and the SFA is a member, the SFA may use cooperative contracts, but only if the original procurement was properly conducted. Even as a member of a cooperative, the SFA must ensure compliance with procurement regulations. Here are some tips for formal contracts. Cost or price analysis. A cost or price analysis is required for all formal procurement actions over the simplified acquisition threshold, including contract modifications. The method and depth of analysis will vary depending on the specific procurement, but the SFA should make independent estimates before receiving bids or proposals. Think of a cost or price analysis as a tool to forecast what your needs are for food, supplies, milk, and services. This should be performed using velocity reports from vendors used in the current year. A velocity report shows a summary of the number of cases purchased by food or items over the school year, along with the total amount paid by item type, and with a grand total for expenditures by vendor for the year. Contact each vendor to obtain velocity reports. Additional considerations come into play when conducting a cost or price analysis, and there is a tool on the next slide that I'll show you to help with that process. The cost or price analysis must be documented and available for review during an administrative review. Evaluation breakdown. Vendors and reviewers must understand how points will be awarded in each evaluation category. For example, if price is weighted 40 points, how will those points be distributed? Including a formula or clear explanation in the solicitation and evaluation tools increases transparency and ensures fairness. Rejecting responses. If a proposal is received after the due date or is otherwise disqualified, The SFA must document the reason for rejection and include the date the proposal was received. This ensures that all decisions are transparent and well documented. Types of formal contracts. There are only two allowable types of formal contracts: fixed price contracts and cost reimbursable contracts. Cost plus a percentage of cost, or cost plus percentage of income contracts, are not allowed under any circumstances. So as discussed earlier, performing a cost or price analysis is a critical step in the formal procurement process that is often overlooked. The primary goal of this analysis is to determine the estimated cost of a product or a service, evaluate if bid pricing received is reasonable, and to confirm whether the cost can be sustained within the SFA's budget. To illustrate an example structure to conduct the analysis is to first use the column titled Product or Service. Use this column to record the items or services that are required for C&P operations in the coming year. So for example, groceries, program foods, paper and supplies, pest control services, etc. Second, under current cost, provide the most recent amount paid for the corresponding product or service list in the first column. Third, under estimated cost, provide the anticipated price of products or services by including any projected changes in enrollment, new or closing schools, changes to the consumer price index over the past year or 3 to 5 year average, or by researching current prices online. Fourth, use the reasonable and sustainable column to indicate yes if the cost is deemed reasonable and can be sustained by the SFA's budget. Performing a cost or price analysis is required for any purchases that are expected to require formal procedures. It is recommended to conduct this analysis prior to soliciting any formal contracts, even if estimated costs are lower than the requirement for formal purchases. This practice encourages the assessment of pricing to ensure they are reasonable and that purchases fit within the budget before proceeding with the procurement process. So, in terms of non-competitive proposals, if a public emergency occurs, such as supply chain disruption, the required time for a formal competitive solicitation may not be feasible. For example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, many SFAs faced challenges in obtaining basic supplies and had to use emergency contracts to secure everyday staples. These emergency situations can justify bypassing the usual competitive procurement process. If a solicitation results in an inadequate number of responses, meaning there are insufficient sources to allow for full and open competition, a non-competitive proposal may be an option. However, the SFA must ensure that they have adequately advertised the procurement and allowed sufficient time for vendors to respond. The SFA must demonstrate that all reasonable steps were taken to encourage competition before determining that the number of bidders was inadequate. In cases where an SFA has extenuating circumstances that justify the use of a non-competitive proposal, the SFA can request prior authorization from the state agency. This request must be made in writing and include a clear explanation of the circumstances that necessitate a non-competitive procurement. If the item or service being procured is only available from one single source, the SFA must pursue a non-competitive contract. However, just because a vendor claims to be the sole source does not automatically mean that the product is genuinely exclusive. The SFA should conduct its own research to verify that no other sources are available. If it is determined to be a sole source, the SFA must seek written approval from the state agency to proceed with the non-competitive procurement. In this section, we will cover some common procurement findings that frequently lead to compliance issues, as well as strategies to prevent these findings. General procurement findings include no written policies. For example, failing to establish or maintain written procurement procedures or having an outdated procurement plan. Incomplete written policies, such as policies missing required content, such as conflict of interest statements or methods of procurement. And written procedures that do not align with the federal guidelines. So for example, thresholds that are less restrictive than required or inadequate procurement steps. Some common micro-purchase findings include exceeding the threshold, so making purchases that exceed the micro-purchase threshold. Failure to self-certify, so not self-certifying and using a higher threshold than allowed. And lack of documentation, so missing or inadequate documentation for purchases such as lost receipts. Small purchase findings include insufficient quotes, failing to solicit quotes from an adequate number of sources, missing specifications, so not having clear, detailed specifications for the goods or services, Inadequate documentation, so failing to maintain complete procurement documentation, including quotes received. So to prevent these common findings, we recommend taking some of the following actions. Implement written policies, so ensure you have comprehensive procurement procedures in place. All staff involved in procurement should be familiar with these policies and procedures, and they should be easily accessible. Regularly update these documents to reflect any changes in federal, state, or local regulations. Follow federal, state, and local guidelines. Ensure that your procurement methods and policies comply with all applicable laws. Keep up to date with any regulatory changes. Select the appropriate procurement method. So always determine the most appropriate procurement method prior to purchasing goods or services. Ensure that it aligns with your district's written procedures. And finally, maintain comprehensive documentation. So keep detailed records for every procurement transaction to demonstrate compliance and provide transparency. For formal procurement, these findings can result in significant findings and corrective action. So below are some frequent mistakes and ways to address them. Purchasing from a third party without competitive bidding. So engaging in procurement from a third party source, such as a state contract, without soliciting multiple bids or proposals. Inadequate solicitations, so solicitation documents that are incomplete or do not meet federal requirements. For example, missing provisions like the Appendix 2 clauses, Buy American, lowest and most responsible bidder, or evaluation factors. Lack of cost or price analysis, so failing to perform the required cost or price analysis to evaluate whether the bid prices are reasonable and within budget. Missing documentation of public advertisement, so failing to provide adequate records of the public advertisement and public bid opening. And failure to monitor the contract, so not monitoring contracts after award, for example, ensuring that the vendor's invoices match contract terms and that unauthorized items are not ordered. To avoid these formal procurement pitfalls, ensure complete solicitation documents. So prior to issuing your IFB or RFP, confirm that the solicitation includes all federal requirements such as Buy American clauses, a clear evaluation process, and a provision for selecting the lowest responsible and responsive bidder. Conduct a cost or price analysis. Always perform a cost or price analysis before awarding a formal contract. This ensures that the prices are reasonable and align with your budget. Understand third-party and co-op rules. If using a piggyback contract, a cooperative purchasing agreement, or a third-party entity, ensure you fully understand and comply with the specific rules for those procurement methods. This includes ensuring proper documentation is in place. Monitor the contract after award. Once the contract is awarded, the work is not finished. Regularly monitor the contract to ensure that vendors are complying with the terms. This includes confirming that prices match the agreed upon rates and that only contracted goods and services are provided. And finally, maintain complete documentation. As always, ensure that all procurement steps, including advertisements, bid openings, and evaluations, are fully documented and available for review during audits. By taking proactive steps to ensure that procurement policies are well-defined, consistently followed, and regularly updated, you can avoid common compliance issues and maintain transparency in your procurement processes. Proper documentation is the foundation for meeting federal, state, and local requirements while ensuring the funds are used effectively and efficiently. The non-federal entities contracts must contain the applicable provisions described in Appendix 2, Part 200, Contract Provisions for non-federal entity contracts under federal awards. There are as many as 8, depending on the contract cost and type of goods or services procured. So just always making sure you're reviewing this and including the applicable contract provisions in your formal solicitations. As we come to the last section of the procurement process review, it's important to highlight several tools and resources that can help you stay on track with your procurement practices and ensure compliance with USDA regulations. These resources are available to you at no cost and should be referenced frequently. USDA procurement regulations may be accessed at the link or QR code on this slide. These regulations will be a reference point for procurement reviews and should be a frequent point of review. Specific regulations tied to the Summer Food Service Program, School Breakfast Program, and Child and Adult Care Food Program are also included at this link. The Louisiana Department of Education, LDOE, provides a CNP resource library, which provides a reference for templates, tools, and guidance on procurement procedures. This includes resources specifically tailored to the needs of school food authorities. So key resources available include template procurement procedures, template code of conduct, formal bid checklists, and formal bid provisions, for example, the Buy American provision. So how do you access this? You can visit the LDOE CNP site, navigate to the resource library, and search under school food service to find procurement resources. The Louisiana Fit Kids training platform offers a variety of resources that can assist with the procurement process, including training slides and videos that directly address procurement requirements. Training slides and videos are provided and updated regularly, so these materials help clarify key procurement topics. And you can access training recordings, so after today's session, the slides and recording will be available here, providing an easy reference for all attendees. The USDA memo on purchasing goods and services is an essential resource for understanding when and how cooperatives, agents, and third-party services can be utilized for procurement. This memo offers helpful Q&A and detailed explanations of the procurement options available to SFAs, including when it is acceptable to use existing contracts without conducting additional competitions. By consistently utilizing these resources, you can ensure that your procurement process remains compliant with federal, state, and local regulations while streamlining your procurement activities and maintaining transparency. So that concludes our overview of the procurement process for child nutrition programs. We really hope this information has helped clarify the various procurement methods, documentation requirements, and resources available to you. Remember, procurement is an ongoing process that requires attention to detail and compliance with federal, state, and local regulations. By following best practices and utilizing the resources we've covered today, you'll be better equipped to ensure transparency, accountability, and compliance in your procurement activities. So at this point, we'd be happy to address any questions you may have. So please feel free to ask about anything from today's presentation or any specific procurement concerns you may be facing in your district. For those really unique situations, we'll just ask that you reach out to your state agency contact who will be able to provide some more tailored assistance. Yep, so if anybody has any questions, you are welcome to put those in the chat, or we can, you can unmute yourself. And we'll just give it a few minutes to see if anybody has any questions. Okay, we have a question for the cost or price analysis. May it be grouped by food or paper, for example, or does each item need to be listed? Yeah, that's a great question. So you want to list it by the like kind item. So that's correct. You would group it by food or paper, and that's so you can ensure that those aggregate purchases for like kind items are, you understand how much you project to spend on those so you can follow the appropriate procurement threshold. Okay, next question. I hope that answers your question, but feel free to follow up if you need more clarification. Does the audit look at the prior year or the current year? Great question. The audit looks at the prior year, so we can take a look at a full year worth of procurement documentation. Could you talk about renewal of formal bids and what should be included in documentation? So this would be, this is going to depend. So if you have a specific renewal in mind, but for example, if you had a, I'll just use a vended meal or catered meal contract as an example. If you amended it in a year to update the pricing, for example, that would need to be a amendment that you make where both the vendor and the SFA have signed off on the updated pricing. So that would be one example. Or if you are adding any goods or services to a contract that were not initially in the initial contractor specifications, then you would want to have a document that clearly outlines the changes that are being made and make sure that that's signed as well. But if you do have any specific questions about renewals, you can absolutely contact your state agency, but just making sure it's very clear what goods or services are being either revised or added to the contract. can you go over the velocity report again? Yes, let me go back to that. So the velocity report is something that you can reach out to to a vendor for, and that's just going to provide, and let me sure I have the so a velocity report, yes. So that shows the summary of the number of cases purchased by food or items over the school year, along with the total amount paid by item type and with a grand total for expenditures by vendor for the year. So this should just help you be able to complete your cost or price analysis. That's the goal of that. And that's just to make sure that you have a good idea of how much you spent on items. So for example, if you were purchasing both food and supplies from one vendor, a velocity report would help to break out how much you spent on both food and supplies so that you can separate those when you're projecting your cost or price analysis. Okay. Does the code of conduct form need to be done annually, or is one time sufficient? So that should be signed annually by all members of the CNP purchasing who are involved in CNP purchasing. So that's a good question. The velocity report, is this something we need to get from every vendor? Great question. So this is not a requirement. The velocity report is not a requirement. That would just be a tool that you could use to conduct your cost or price analysis. So the cost or price analysis is required for any purchases over the simplified acquisition threshold. But the velocity report would just be a tool that you could use if you are needing a source to be able to forecast your future costs. So that's not a requirement from each vendor. But as I said, if you have one vendor that you purchase lots of food and supplies from, then that is an instance where it might be helpful to get that report so you can identify and separate how much you're spending on, for example, produce versus supplies if you want to go out for bid for those groups individually. Right, exactly. Yes. So yeah, once again, the velocity report is not a requirement. And if you have a vendor that doesn't know what that is, then that's okay. You can conduct your cost or price analysis in other ways. For example, looking at what you've spent at those for those vendors in the past, or looking at projected quantities and then looking at market prices and being able to base your cost or price analysis on that. So yes, the velocity report is just supplemental if you have a vendor that's able to provide it. If we are scheduled for a review in the 26 to 27 school year, the 25 to 26 school year will be examined, correct? That is correct. So for procurement, and this just applies to the procurement review and the resource management review for some areas. So yes, you will be looking at the prior school year for procurement. Okay, we'll give it a couple more minutes to see if anyone else has some questions. Yep, and you'll be able to review these slides after the call once we're able to get them up. And then if you do have, as I mentioned, any specific questions, you can reach out to your state agency and they'll be able to provide some more guidance, as well as referencing those tools that we reviewed at the end of the presentation. Does the procurement standards of conduct require that everyone in our office or just me as a supervisor sign it? So this would be anyone who is involved with purchasing goods or services for the child nutrition program. So that would apply just to make sure that there's no conflict of interest when awarding contracts, or that no employees are accepting gifts in exchange for contract preference. So that would be anyone who is involved. So you can use your discretion of who would need to sign that report. Regarding state contract items, am I understanding that those items need to be included as one of your bids, or can those items be purchased separately as a micro purchase depending on the price? So that's a good question. If you are forecasting, when you're completing that cost or price analysis and you're forecasting the total amount that you plan to spend. So for example, the US Foods contract, if you're forecasting how much you plan to spend on food, and that is somehow below $10,000, then you could, or your local threshold, you could purchase directly from the state contract. However, for something like that, where for food where you likely will spend over the micro purchase threshold, then you'll want to follow either small or formal procurement and use the state contract as one of those quotes or bids. So yes, it does depend on how much you plan to spend. Absolutely. One complaint I have heard is the short turnaround for requests of information during those reviews. Do we get a list of exactly what you need with the tentative date you need it when submitted at first contract? So this is a good question. So the initial documents that we'll be requesting are that procurement plan and the code of conduct, vendor paid list, detailed general ledger, and the procurement tool. So once you give us that documentation, that's the initial documentation, and then we will review the procurement tool, make sure it's completed accurately and entirely completed. And from there, we will select certain vendors for review, and we will send you the list of exactly what documentation that we'll need with the due date. So it is kind of a two-step process, but both times you'll be given a list of exactly what you need, and then the due dates. And of course, sometimes there's always instances where the documentation provided raises some additional questions. So in that case, there might be some follow-ups, but that is the general rule. Will slides be emailed or provided on Louisiana Fit Kids? So I believe it was mentioned that this we'll be coordinating with the state agency to ensure that these are posted. So Casey, if you have any information on that, then you can chime in, but we should be connecting with the state agency on where the slides and the script will be posted.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, I can, Misty.
Yes, if y'all send me the slides, I can get them posted on Louisiana Fit Kids.
Perfect. Great. Okay, thank you, Misty. So yes, those slides will be posted on Louisiana Fit Kids. Okay, and I know we're running a little short on time, so Casey, you can feel free to cut me off if needed, but we only had one vendor to reply to our bid. We sent it out to others, but did I understand you to say this process was not required? So depending on if it's for small or formal procurement, so if it is for small purchase, if you are contacting multiple vendors and you only are receiving one response, then you do need to at least collect responses from other vendors explaining why they are not responding to your bid. So if you only have one vendor responding, then at that point, it's time to kind of ask a few more questions about, have I adequately advertised? Have I taken all of the steps that I can to solicit more quotes? Is there anything in the solicitation that's limiting competition or restricting it? And then at that point, you can reach out to the state agency or other SFAs in your district to see if they have a list of other vendors that can be used. And then at that point, it might be appropriate to follow your local non-competitive procurement procedures if you're still unable to receive a second or third bid or quote. Will administrative reviews be in person for 25 to 26 or virtual? So there is, and if Casey's on, I can let him kind of explain this more, but for administrative reviews, there's a portion of the review that is offsite. So for example, for procurement, we are going to collect all of the documentation prior to the on-site review, and we'll make sure it's completed prior to that date, but then you will have someone coming on site as well to complete that portion of the review. So it is both offsite and on site. Okay, perfect. Yep, so it is both. Do we need to have an actual contract with the vendor that has a state contract used as a bid. I'm not sure if I entirely understand this question. Emily, did you understand this? So do we need to have
Are
an
you,
actual?
I think the question's asking if they're using the state contract, do they need to have a contract in place with them? Or, I mean, Rebecca, do you want to explain your question a little further? Yes, okay. So no, if you're using the state contract as a source of pricing and they end up being the lowest price and that's what you're using, then that state contract
No,
would
it's
be.
Tess at
sorry.
schoolfoodsolutions.org.
Sorry, did you hear that? Did that answer your question? Okay. Okay. So my understanding is you're asking if you're using a state contract as your vendor, do you need an additional contract with it? No, I do not believe you do need to have a separate contract. If you have done your solicitation and you're using the state contract as a source of pricing and that pricing is the lowest, then you can just go ahead and use that contract. But again, you want to keep documentation showing that you did get two sources of pricing. You're welcome.
Thanks. Okay, I know that we are a few minutes over, so but I do want to make sure everyone, gets their questions answered. And of course, after this call, if you do have additional questions, you can reach out. Okay, I'm not seeing any additional questions in the chat. So once again, we will have the slides and the notes posted to Louisiana Fit Kids after this call. So we just want to thank everyone for attending. We appreciate you taking the time, and good luck with all of your administrative reviews in the future. And we look forward to working with, I'm sure, many of you. So. Great. Okay. Thank you, everybody.